Poetry isn't an easy subject for a documentary, but a new biography of Mary Oliver is exceptional. I speak to the director, Sasha Waters. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Mary Oliver died in 2019, but her poetry remains ever present. She lived much of her life in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and generally stayed out of the public spotlight, even after she won the Pulitzer Prize. These days, her work has a fresh life on social media. I'm one of those readers who discovered her quoted on Instagram. It was her short poem, Don't Hesitate, and it goes like this. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. Mary Oliver is a poet who's accessible even to people who rarely read poetry. Her collection called Devotions is a never-fail gift. I hardly knew anything of her biography until the new documentary, Mary Oliver, Saved by the Beauty of the World. It's being released to theaters by Kino Lorber starting on July 3rd in New York, Provincetown, and Coral Gables. It was produced by American Masters and will air on PBS in late August. In the film, we hear from people who knew Mary Oliver, including the poet Mark Doty, the journalist Maria Shriver, and, unexpected to me, the filmmaker Sasha Waters. We also hear from admirers such as Oprah Winfrey and Stephen Colbert. The director, Sasha Waters, and I first met in our 20s working on the crew of a PBS documentary. Sasha was also co-directing her first indie doc about New York's dominatrix scene. I was a Midwesterner dazzled by Manhattan. Sasha was a native New Yorker who sought a quieter life in the Midwest. She became a film professor at the University of Iowa and now teaches at Virginia Commonwealth University. All the while, she maintained a parallel career as a doc maker. One of her celebrated works is Garry Winogrand, All Things Are Photographable, about the renowned street photographer. IndieWire critic David Ehrlich praised the Winogrand doc for finding new ways to enliven an old form. I asked Sasha what she learned making a film about Garry Winogrand that she could apply to Mary Oliver.
That's such a great question. I mean, I have long felt like there's a kind of affinity between photography and poetry. I mean, from a filmmaking perspective, they're very different because with Winogrand, of course, there's a lot to look at. There's an immense body of work, a huge visual archive, and winnowing it down was the challenge. Winnowing down the Mary Oliver work, the challenge there was the number of poems and the question of, well, what are we looking at? But this affinity between photography and poetry, I feel, is grounded in the idea that they both use encounters with the real world, right? If we're talking about representational photography, not really abstract photography, right? But so they both use these representations of the real world and kind of concrete images or language in the case of poetry and render them something new and something different through metaphor, either visual metaphor or verbal metaphor. So that was something I really thought a lot about in terms of that relationship between the written word and photography. I think, Mary Oliver and Garry Winogrand may seem like very different kinds of subjects. Like he's very brash and ebullient and engaging, and she is engaging in a different way, like engaging through her work, but in her personality is maybe a little shyer and more recessive. But they share these really interesting qualities. Like they are both have extreme self-discipline with regard to craft. They're both they both have a kind of enduring sense of loneliness in their work, and they both have a desire to be invisible, which they speak about explicitly, which I think is interesting. I think for me, I'm also really attracted to this idea of outsiders who are always outsiders. Like so much of American culture and American success stories, or even stories of American failure, are about stories of people who are outsiders trying to get on the inside. And these are both outsiders who are just, they're doing their own thing. And I really admire that.
So, my understanding is that you had worked with PBS's American Masters on the Gary Winogrand film, and they were in contact with Mary Oliver's estate and looking for a filmmaker and approached you about this project. Do I have that right?
Well, the Gary Winogrand film was my film that American Masters boarded. They licensed the film, but it was sort of it was a more independent project, I would say. I did all of the fundraising. And so with this new project, it was a different process. I actually had been working on a different film with American Masters that had been in development for quite some time, a film about the incredible artist Ruth Asawa, 20th century craft artist and sculptor based in San Francisco. And then that film was moving along, but we ran into some issues with the access agreement, and it had to be tabled. So at around that same time period, when I was really brokenhearted about losing this Ruth Asawa film, which I still hope I or even somebody else gets to make someday, this Mary Oliver film came about. And I'm a huge Mary Oliver fan. The first conversation I had with Michael Cantor, I said, I literally have Upstream, her collection of essays, sitting right next to me as we're talking. I also had the unusual circumstance of having, because I make 16 millimeter personal experimental films in more of this sort of art world context, I have a huge collection of archive films, and I happen to collect footage of dogs. So I immediately told Michael, I have been collecting footage of dogs for 20 years, and I never knew what I was going to do with it. And so now all of these dogs, not all of them, but many of them have ended up in the Mary Oliver film.
Which is pertinent because she had a great love of
Yes.
dogs and wrote poetry about dogs. Can you pick a Mary Oliver poem that was especially meaningful to you before you started this project?
Sure. I think, in the film, kind of leading up to Mary's passing, we use the poem When Death Comes, and it's introduced by Garrison Keillor from the Writer's Almanac, which I think so many of us of a certain generation were introduced to different poems and poets through the Writer's Almanac, which ran on public radio, National Public Radio, for years and years and years, where Garrison Keillor would read a different poem every day. And I am fairly certain that was the first poem. I mean, I know it was the first poem by Mary Oliver that really stopped me in my tracks. I heard it. I went back and looked up when it was broadcast. It was broadcast in, I believe it was in 2004, which is when I would have been pregnant. So I have this image, maybe a real or a kind of and mentally enhanced memory of being in my kitchen in Iowa and stopping and listening to this poem, When Death Comes, which in the film we use it, like I said, to introduce Mary's death, but we also experimented with opening the film with that poem because it's a poem very much about being younger and thinking about what you want your life to be like, how you want to feel in the future when you are facing this experience, and what you want to make sure you have done or felt so that when death comes, you're not, you don't find yourself sighing and full of argument, as she writes.
Can you elaborate on how you were grappling with those things in your own life?
I mean, I think we all grapple with those things. I think at that time in particular, I was in the process of starting a family and thinking about how my life would change, and I think that is an age, I was in my mid 30s. And so I think, that's an age where one starts to think about decisions being a little more permanent, right? I think like when we're in our 20s, I mean, we knew each other in our 20s. It's much more a period of like, it's like, I like to call that time in my life, like the phase of chance operations, like you're going to try this thing, you're going to take this job, you're going to date this person. It's like it's the time before, it's like when life is still pretty undecided. And so when you're in your 30s and you're starting to realize like, oh, I've made these choices. And then this is, I'm not in the multiverse. This is the universe that I'm in, and this is the life that I'm living. You start to think about those choices and how you might feel about them and reflect back on them years later.
So you get this assignment to make a film about Mary Oliver, and what did you use as your framework to begin? There isn't, to my knowledge, an existing biography of her, and so what did you even know about the story, and how did you figure out the story?
So her biography is in progress. So Lindsay Whalen, who has been working on the biography since Mary was still alive, so I believe since 2017, was an incredible resource and asset, just a wealth of knowledge and information. She's in the film. Like we did a very long interview with her. She was also a consultant to the film, so she was really crucial. And Mary Oliver's archive now is in the Library of Congress, but it didn't get delivered there until, and it's about between 30 and 40 boxes. So before that archive was deposited at the Library of Congress, Lindsay had those boxes with her in Connecticut, where she lives. And then I was able to get access to them through Mary's wonderful estate, Bill Reichblum in Northwest Orchard. He has an office in Washington, D.C. So I went there for two kind of 7 to 10 day periods. One was in the summer and one was in the winter, and just literally lived. He set aside a room for me surrounded by these piles of boxes, and I lived in his office with a huge flatbed scanner and just went through and read and scanned everything I thought I might need. So it was a little backwards in that sense. Like I think very often you would create a film and have a timeline and a structure and then go to the archive looking for what you think you need. And there were many things that I scanned that I didn't really need, right? But it was sort of this sense of like, well, who knows what we might need. So that was really helpful. And then, of course, talking to other poets and people who actually knew Mary, and including her very good friend John Waters, who really was able to tell some great stories about her, and other folks as well.
So let me ask you about John Waters. When I first saw the film and he appears early on, my first thought was like, oh, how interesting that John Waters, passed through Mary Oliver's life at some point. And then as the film continues, I realized that John Waters was not a figure who just passed through Mary Oliver's life. He was integral in her life, and her partner, Mary Malone Cook, knew them for decades. When did you come to understand that John Waters was such a figure in this story?
Well, he was the very first person we interviewed, because in some of that early research, even sort of the few things I was able to find online, aside from the poetry and the essays and so forth, the rare interviews with Mary, and there are interviews with John Waters in which he talks about how one of his first jobs in Provincetown was working at that bookstore. So Provincetown is really, we associate John Waters with Baltimore, of course, but Provincetown is really central to his story because he has been spending every summer there, I think since the 60s, basically. So he goes there a lot. And one of his first jobs was working in Molly's bookstore. And so I knew that he had this connection. And so before we were even fully in production, we were in this holding pattern waiting to hear about our grant from the NEH. I convinced WNET, I said, why don't you just give me like a little bit of money? Baltimore's right down the road because I live in Richmond, Virginia. I'll take my crew from Richmond and we'll go and we'll do this interview. Because also I knew, you just can look him up online and see from his website. He's extremely busy. He travels a lot. So I thought, let's get him whenever we can just to get it. And then we'll have that. So that was really exciting that was the first interview because he had a lot to say.
Now, I happen to know that you have your own John Waters connection from your childhood, and I need to get you to explain that.
Okay, so, and this is funny because I was just at the Provincetown Film Festival and John Waters was there too. I saw him. And many people that weekend, which doesn't often happen, asked me if I'm related to him. And I should have joked like, yes, he's actually my dad. But my father, who is now deceased, was an artist and graphic designer whose name was John Waters. And he, at the time that I was growing up, he was the only John Waters in the Manhattan phone book. And so and he also had a business that was named after him, John Waters Design, or Waters Design. And so there was a period of time where we would get phone calls, messages, in the middle of the night, people calling up and leaving phone messages for John Waters, the filmmaker, for Divine, so on and so forth. Because in the 80s, John Waters was quite ascendant. People knew who he was, but people didn't necessarily associate him with Baltimore. And then the other piece of this is that my father started getting invitations to these elite clubs. This was the era of like big, splashy nightclubs in New York, like the Palladium, Area, the Limelight. And so somehow, because my father's name was John Waters, he would come home, I'd be in high school, he would come home and say, oh, I got this, invitation to Andy Warhol's birthday party to John Waters, meaning the filmmaker. Do you want it? And so I would take it and go with my friends and, go to the open bar. And then we'd get bored because we were 16 years old and leave. But when I finally met John Waters in person, it was very exciting to tell him this story and then to apologize to him for stealing his party invitations all those years ago.
So that's a critical interview in this film, and then you interview a number of poets, some who knew Mary, some who don't, but are moved by her work. You interview other high-profile figures who have been impacted in a big way by her work. Who were the other people that you felt were really bringing you close to Mary?
Certainly Maria Shriver. I think in the moment in the film where Maria Shriver appears, it's near the last third to 25% of the film, because they met when Mary was later in Mary's life. And I think it can be a little bit of an odd moment if you don't know that they were friends and had this kind of unusual friendship, the odd couple friendship almost, I would say, when all of a sudden Maria Shriver appears on the screen. You think, wait a minute, where is this going? How does Maria Shriver fit in? But it's really kind of a wonderful story, because Maria Shriver was this huge fan of Mary Oliver, as she describes in the film. At the time that they met, she was the First Lady of California, and she organized this very large women's conference, several years running, and would invite Mary over and over and over again to please come. And then finally, after 6 years, Mary did come to Maria's conference. Maria ended up doing an interview with her for O Magazine. Let's see, do I want to talk about the content of that interview, or?
I think it's worth going into. Spoiler alert if you haven't watched the film yet, but
yeah, I mean, it's sort of known. So Mary Oliver was the survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and it was something that she became consciously aware of when she was in her 40s. I believe it was after her father died, and when she was back with her mother, kind of her elderly mother, and kind of being back in Ohio and revisiting her childhood, raised these issues of childhood trauma that she became aware of, and that you start to see quite clearly in the poems from that time. However, she didn't speak about it publicly until she was in her 70s. And so the first person who she tells is her friend Maria Shriver in this very moving interview, which we found as a print interview because it was published in O Magazine, which is the outlet that Maria was interviewing her for. But luckily, the photographer, who was also a videographer, who had taken photos of them together and also videotaped the interview, all these years later, still had that footage. So it's such a crucial piece of the film.
No, I think you're making that sound a little too easy, because I would love for you to tell the story about how you actually drew the connection between the print interview that was in your hand and getting the video that we see in the film, which is, quite a meaningful part of the film.
Right. Well, because there's a print interview, I'm thinking, well, there's got to be an audio file. I mean, it just didn't even occur to me that it would have been videotaped because it was done for a magazine. So there are photos in the magazine and there's a print interview. So I became obsessed with finding this audio file from late 2010. I should say that's when the interview is. So I was just constantly hassling everybody at Maria Shriver Enterprises and really everybody at Harpo Productions, which is Oprah's, media enterprise. Just I kept thinking, it's got to be somewhere. It's got to be in the archive. It's got to be someone emailed that audio file to someone to have it transcribed, right? Someone sharing it, and no one could find it. No one could find it. No one could find it. And we actually did not know what we were going to do with this problem. And then finally, when we were interviewing Maria Shriver, I said to her, at one point in a down moment, I said, we have not been able to find this audio file, and it's like making me crazy. I don't know what to do. And she said, oh, it wasn't just audio. The guy who was with us, he videotaped it too. He was a freelance guy who lived down there, and we hired him, and he was great. He took the photos and he did the video. And she just said, I bet he still has it. And I was like, no way. I mean, it's more than, 15 years. And Joel, my friend from college who was shooting that particular interview, goes, oh, I bet that guy still has it. And I was like, no, don't get my hopes up. Don't get my hopes up. And sure enough, Rob Howard, if you're listening to this, Rob and Lisa, total lifesavers. Rob had it. His wife, Lisa, was great. She just pulled it right off the shelf and sent it to me. And we were able to license the footage and the photos. It was really one of those very special, gift from the documentary gods, for sure.
Yes, I think those are the things that people do not realize when they're watching films, that stuff doesn't just appear ready-made.
The other thing like that I'm going to tell you about, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but in the film, there was a film that was shot in the late 60s by the National Park Service called The Song of the Sandy Mooring. And it's a 16 millimeter, 30-minute short film all about Cape Cod, much of which centers on Provincetown. And it was made for the National Park Service. So much of it is the beauty and the landscape and so on and so forth. And we use a lot of that footage because it's in the National Archives. We use a lot of that footage in the film. But in the film twice, you see, it's pretty short, a shot of Mary Oliver when she's quite young and she's working in Molly's bookstore. And it's from that film. I mean, she's just a young woman, not even quite 30, working in a bookstore. And it just so happens that when they made this film about Cape Cod, they filmed Mary Oliver. So that too was just this remarkable, of all the people they could have filmed in Provincetown. I mean, there are other few people in the film, but that she is actually in it at that very young age was also really special.
And did you discover that yourself, or did someone know that and point? Well, you're just.
Actually, you know what? Wait. Actually, Lindsay might have told me that. Lindsay might have told me. I can't remember. I knew about the film and I got the footage. But Lindsay might have said, "Oh, get ready, Mary's actually in that film." So that I'm not sure about.
One thing that you talk about in the film is that is the critical perception of Mary Oliver. She had these wonderful recognitions in midlife, the Pulitzer Prize, National Book Award, but critics and someone makes the point, academics often had a kind of mixed attitude about her, or a downright dismissive attitude about her. I think someone says in the film that for decades she had never been reviewed in the New York Times, gotten a full review in the New York Times. Some people say that they perceived her poems as, quote, nature poems, and wished that she would take on different subject matter. There's a kind of dichotomy between the people who are totally devoted to her and the people who had weren't on her wavelength in some way. And I wonder how you explored that and confronted that.
One criticism of the Gary Winogrand film that I thought was fair was that in places it got a little too academic or inside baseball, about photography and the construction of the image. And so I was quite conscious to not want to do that in the Mary Oliver film. And I was really lucky to have a co-editor, Megan Sims, who kept me on track. She would just say, stay on the highway of story, because I am a person who can potentially spin off and be very interested in, this difference between what's called sort of language poetry and maybe more popular accessible forms, but it's not quite something for a general audience. So thinking about how to convey that idea of the popular and the accessible versus the more erudite and intellectual, but without necessarily bashing other kinds of poetry, it was a little bit of a fine line to walk. So that it was helpful to have multiple voices come in and talk about it. I think Ada Limon, who is the previous poet laureate of the United States, talks about the relationship between popular audiences, the difference between what a popular audience might feel and what other poets who are in the academy or who are the editors of publications and so on and so forth, that they might have a different kind of relationship to the work. And I think it's a pendulum. I mean, I do feel like part of Mary's resurgence now is not just the popular appreciation of her work, which was always there. It is also that there is a whole generation of poets who studied under Mark Doty because he taught at so many places and always taught Mary Oliver, or poets like Ada Limon, who writes so beautifully about the natural world, or like Major Jackson, who Major Jackson and actually Ada and Gabby all went through the Fine Arts Work Center fellowship program in Provincetown. So I think there's this way in which that resurgence is generational too. Like that there's a generation of poets who did study Mary Oliver and who do read her and teach her and appreciate her and take from her work and move that approach to poetry forward.
One of the stipulations I think you had from the estate is that if you were going to quote Mary Oliver's poems, the poem needed to be read in full. And I wonder how that shaped your structure.
I mean, that was a comedy of chaos from the very beginning, because we had to say we will not excerpt any poems, but we also had to tell the estate in advance which poems we wanted to use. So that was a really long part of the process of our research, really figuring out, of course, you want some very popular, beloved poems that everyone knows, like Wild Geese or Don't Hesitate. I really wanted to include poems that people didn't know as well. So we had our list, it was approved, and the the chaos comes in when, as soon as we start talking to people and interviewing them, everybody has their favorite poem. And I have my copy of Devotions and they're taking the book and going through it. Or Stephen Colbert pulls it up on his phone. So as soon as the reality of being in the moment in a documentary interview is there, all those rules go out the window. I mean, I wasn't going to stop people and say, no, the estate has not approved that poem, let's not go there. Because I felt luckily, that if it was something that we felt like we wanted to use, we could go back to the estate and they would approve it. And so, for example, that incredible poem that's really just 2 lines long that Jason Reynolds reads, called "Was It Necessary to Do It?" about the ant, that was completely spontaneous. And there were other moments as well. Danica Kelly reading from Messenger. So we were really lucky to have a very warm and understanding relationship with the estate.
So you do have some people who are well known outside the world of poetry. Mm-hmm. Helena Bonham Carter reads poems. Steve Buscemi reads a poem. Oprah talks about her love for Mary Oliver. Stephen Colbert, as you mentioned, which personally, I think all of those presences are well earned. They come genuinely to Mary Oliver with a love for her work, but it's always like a little kind of tricky when you're bringing in a famous person to a world that they aren't exactly belong to. So, how are you thinking about that?
I mean, it was certainly a challenge because I do feel like, just in general, in the culture, the presence of celebrity it's helpful, it's useful, it does draw attention to a project, and so there's pressure on TikTokers, everyone from not just documentary filmmakers, right, but all kinds of people competing for attention in a media landscape. And so that's a reality. But wanting to keep it grounded in people who had an authentic relationship to Mary Oliver was very important to me. I did feel like, oh, I wonder what Mary would think of this. I mean, I did think, one person involved in the film said, oh, Oprah, like in some ways that just like feeds the fuel of the fire of the critics, right? Because it's Oprah, it represents a particular kind of cultural production that I think, in some windows, it's very easy to criticize. But at the end of the day, I think Mary wanted people to discover her poems. And so if Stephen Colbert, being really moved by The Summer Day, is going to make someone who, hears about the film or watches the film say, oh, I think I'd like to really read that poem, then that's great.
So you just had the experience of going to Provincetown, that was Mary's home for decades. She described it as her heaven. What was that experience like, showing it there?
That was extremely, extremely special. So the film screened on a Thursday at Town Hall, and the screening was booked for 4:00. So I actually was coming. I did a series of screenings in upstate New York. Then I got to Boston, dropped off my rental car, and jumped on the ferry, got into Provincetown just an hour before the screening. And there's a Provincetown local who I've become friends with, Steve Swanson, and he's a wash ashore because he's only been there for 50 years. But so he was there with his son. We walk into Town Hall and his son says to me, I don't think I've been in this room since my high school prom. It was that kind of local experience. And then our friends from the Coffee Klatch that I would have coffee with every morning at 8:00, locals who live there year round, they were all there. And I mean, it was packed. It was sold out. It was probably between 400 and 500 people, a long line. And it was really just uproariously fun, especially, Steve is quite funny in the film, and then also John Waters. I will say one thing, and I don't know, you can tell me if you want to cut this. I'm going to tell a John Waters story about Provincetown, but it's like, I'm mixed on it. So at the brunch, at the filmmaker brunch, I reintroduced myself to John Waters. I congratulated him because he's got 2 films in re-release right now. And they're at IFC, because he said they're at IFC. And I said, oh, I know, I'm so excited because the Mary Oliver film is opening at IFC. And I think the trailer is playing before your films. It's all very exciting. And John Waters said, when is your film opening? And I said, July 3rd, so the holiday weekend. And he said, like really loud, like loud enough that people turned and looked at us. Oh my God, that's terrible. And I said, well, I know it's not. I said, it's a holiday weekend. He said, no, it's really bad. It's like the worst weekend you could possibly open a movie. So I guess if you want to keep this in, I would just say, if you're listening to this in New York, please go see the movie on opening weekend so we can prove John Waters wrong.
I want to thank Sasha Waters for speaking with me. Her film, Mary Oliver, Saved by the Beauty of the World, opens on July 3rd in New York, Provincetown, and Coral Gables, Florida. Look for further theatrical dates from the distributor Kino Lorber. It will air on PBS's American Masters on August 25th. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, Doc Voices editor Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.